Okay, I hope you have a coffee. This one's going to be a little bit more involved. I'm going to take you through the orientation that I take my athletes through as we're just getting started training, talking about training, digging into some of the tools that you can use to track your training, analyze your training, and basically inform smarter training going forward. So I'm going to be talking a lot about training peaks, setting that up. I'm going to talk a lot about the devices, equipment that you can use to basically capture data from your training, and then how to put it into different software applications to analyze it to inform your training. Again, with the purpose of answering the big question, which is how much should you train and how much should you rest? Really, that is the question you should always be asking yourself. Essentially, we're trying to achieve the perfect balance between stressing yourself out and resting so that you don't get injured along the journey. So optimize performance through enough rest, and I'll say minimize the risk of injury through the amount of stress. So we're also going to kind of flip the way that you look at training. Typically, we think that when we're training, we're working hard, that's when we're getting better. And then when we rest, we kind of lose fitness. It's actually going to be the other way around. When you are working hard, that's when you're going to be slowing down, getting worse, performance decreasing. When you allow your body to rest, repair, that's when you're actually going to get faster. So, digging right into training peaks, typically you're going to be looking at the calendar view, so I'm just going to flip back to that really quickly. I'm going to show you right into my training peaks, so no secrets here. When you click on the dashboard button, that's going to bring you to a whole bunch of charts and graphs that you can use to analyze. You can customize all of these. I'm not going to get into that today, but I want to start with the performance management chart because I will say this is kind of the high level view of really what we're trying to do in training peaks. And then we'll whittle it down into the nitty gritty in terms of what actually populates this chart, right down from your training stress scores, weekly, digging into workouts, and then going right into setting training zones that will, again, ensure all this data is as valid and reliable as possible. And then we'll finish off, and it may not be in this order, I'll probably jump around a little bit, in terms of the collection of data with some of the devices, smartwatches, bike computers, etc. So what you're looking at right now is my last year of training. Breaking it down, you see three distinct lines here. The one line is blue and it's filled in. This is your fitness score, or more accurately, it is your chronic training stress. So it's your training stress that you've loaded on your body over the last 42 days, and it's kind of just this running average. So basically the idea is the higher that chronic training stress goes, or your fitness score goes, the more in shape you are. Because you've loaded on a whole bunch of training stress. The pink line is your acute training load, or ATL, and that is your short-term training stress. And what you see here is the short-term training stress goes up and up and up, and then you see it come back down, sometimes pretty far back down. This would have been peaking out for a race, and then after taking a little bit of time off, and then bringing it back up for another training block, a little bit of recovery time, back up again. Sometimes there's little mishaps in there, like getting sick or injured. But yeah, that's essentially what we're using, or what I'm using the acute training load for is, it will signify each training block. So working for a couple of weeks, stressing myself out, and then allowing myself to recover. And ideally, we can use these numbers to build each training block, so each training block has just a little bit higher training stress than the last one. Again, this is not perfect because training isn't perfect. There's going to be little bumps along the way, but essentially that's what we're trying to achieve with that. And then the yellow is the inverse relationship of acute training load. It is your form or freshness, or TSB, training stress balance. So basically, as I mentioned earlier, as you rest, that's when your body repairs, it recovers, it grows stronger, because it knows you're probably going to do it again. And that's when you're going to be performing at your best. So this is a metric that you can use in terms of preparing for race day. It can be used for ensuring that you're getting adequate recovery on your recovery periods, whatever that might be, and keep everything in balance. So ideally, when we're looking at it at a high level, again, we start a training block, we stress ourselves out, and then we recover, and basically just keep repeating. So looking at my last year here, I started the year really early, so the fitness stays pretty high. And again, this is just, again, your chronic training stress. It's not necessarily performance. Performance did continually build a bit. And essentially this last little push here, you can see I did a really big block. This is where I peaked out for what I thought was gonna be my big event, which was Ironman Canada at this particular time. Unfortunately, a week before the event, it got canceled and didn't happen. So I decided to take a little bit of time. As you can see, lots of rest. Pretty much did nothing for a week as I kind of recalibrated my brain. And then I signed up for another Ironman a few months later, which happened at this peak over here. That was Ironman Arizona. And as you can see, I had a few blocks leading up to that. Not the best lead up. The fitness stayed pretty level. I had a couple sicknesses in there, and to be honest, this is where the power of time and data comes in. The more data you have and the more time you can go back and analyze, I can easily say I was stagnant pretty early on, and to push even farther past August, which I had planned to race, basically, I kind of got stale. I maintained fitness, but I really didn't build to beyond, what I would have done back here in August, what I showed up and did in November. So in November, the performance was kind of lackluster. I think I would have done better in August. And, again, great lesson learned that you can only maintain a particular fitness level or chronic training stress for so long before the body just gets tired. Hormones start to deregulate a bit. And your body needs these off seasons, these times for rest, basically to reset itself. And as you can see, I excelled at that beautifully this year. I took a very low-key off season. I did, all these little dots here are workouts. I did keep active, but again, in terms of structured training or loading on a bunch of training stress, I allowed myself a good amount of rest because I really needed it. And mentally, I was done at that point. And now, as you can see, I'm starting to build, getting ready for this next season. And I've put in 2 good blocks. The first one here, the second one, I had a little bit of a running injury. I would have hoped it would have peaked out a little higher. And kind of is what it is. And hopefully the next block I will be able to build the acute training load just a little bit farther. So really, that's what we're using Training Peaks for: logging your workouts, tracking your progress, and basically informing how much can you handle going forward. Now, this is more on the science side of things. Training is just as much as an art, and I'll say I would put even more emphasis on the art side of things, meaning the feelings, the emotions, etc. I'd say we're more feeling emotional beings than we are data-driven analytic beings. That being said, some of you are very scientific. But when you marry the two, and basically marrying the data with how you feel, that's when you really put context towards these numbers. That's kind of why I just talked through a little bit about what I was feeling as I went through last year, kind of what the numbers were saying, how I performed. And again, that can inform your strategy for next year. And that's exactly what it did. I knew I needed to take a big long break, and I'm hoping that this uptrend I can continue until I actually peak out for my main event, which is later on in the summer, a few months down the road, as opposed to just staying stagnant, fit but not building. And I think I'll have a better performance if I can do that. So what feeds these numbers? I talked about chronic training load and acute training load. But it all comes down to training stress. You're going to see that number quite a bit in Training Peaks. TSS stands for Training Stress Score. And basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is how much stress you loaded on your body at any given time or in any given workout. There's an old adage you've probably heard many times, especially if you're a runner: don't increase your run volume any more than 10% per week. And that's a nice safe number. That's been debunked like everything else. Depending on your training history, you might be able to handle 20% or 30%, or maybe even less if you're just coming off the couch. So it really is individualistic, and there's a lot of variables that come into play. Now, that's all well and good, and a good little rule of thumb to follow, but what about intensity? So if I'm running the same pace, and some of you run the same pace all the time, so this will work for you. You can do 10% increase per week and probably be pretty safe. But what if your intensity changes? So what if you're doing really hard runs and then some really easy runs? How do you quantify 10% per week? And that's really what Training Peaks answers with the training stress score. So it takes in the two variables of time, which again is the easy one, and then intensity, which tends to be a little more difficult. And we have to do a little bit more work to actually set our intensity levels to make sure that we are getting accurate scores. And that's when we're going to jump to the end when we talk about testing and setting training zones, etc. But don't worry, I'll get there. So training stress score, every workout you're going to get a training stress score. So if I open, I don't know if we'll open this run I did this morning. And it's ended up to be a lot longer. The track was still frozen, so we kind of had to stick around for a little while and wait for it to unfreeze so we could lay down a good 5K test set, which was terrible. Pretty much all the testing is going to be terrible, so I mean, embrace it. It's a great way to prepare for racing, because that's the pain you're probably going to feel, and getting set up and mentally prepared for those types of efforts is a good thing to practice. But anyway, I digress. The duration's a little bit longer, but what I really want to be concerned about is the training stress score. So I had planned to do a 54, or the way the workout builder, and again, I'm not going to get into all the details, but I've built these workouts, and very specifically in terms of work and rest intervals and different intensities based on threshold, which again, I'm going to talk about in a second, so don't worry if that just went over your head. But basically, this would be a visual representation of time and intensity through the workout. And from this is where Training Peaks will automatically calculate the training stress score. So for this workout particularly, it said it should have stressed me out to a number of 54. Just to give you a reference, if you ran as hard as you could for about an hour, you would get a training stress score of 100, assuming everything is set correctly. So you can go above 100 if you're training longer than an hour, doing some long runs or rides, even swims. And obviously, if it's under an hour, depending on your intensity, it's going to be anywhere between that 20 to 100. So every workout has one of these training stress scores, and when I flip back to your dashboard, that's really what you're seeing with all these dots. These are, the red dots are all the workouts that I did. And obviously, the higher the red dot, the higher the training stress. So again, this big ride I did on this day, I got a training stress score of 379. That was probably a big day. I did 141 kilometers on the bike, 10 kilometer run, 3,000 meter. Oh, that's a double. I got to fix that. Yep. Anyway, so there is a little bit of work that is required to maintain all this as well. And even I am not always as disciplined as I should be to keep this all clean. So every workout has a training stress, and it feeds your overall chart there, performance management chart, to again tell you where you're at stress and rest wise. You also have training stress scores or summaries for the week. So as you can see, the numbers, these should already be familiar to you. The fitness or CTL chronic training load, that would be the blue line, kind of shows where you're at each week. So right now I'm sitting at 72. My fatigue is at 77, so my acute training load, and then my form or freshness, that yellow line, the training stress balance is at -4. So I'm on a little deload week. I'll say more of a testing week because the intensity's been pretty high. Actually, the volume's low, so it is a deload week. So I should see from this week here, I actually peaked out at 74. My acute training load was up to 99. My fatigue or form is down to 21. And as you can see, since I'm still in this week, this would be as if I completed it as programmed. My fitness is actually going to come down. But as mentioned earlier, my performance by the end of this week being more rested is actually going to be better than it was at the end of this week with a higher fitness score. And then when I get back into it, as you can see, I'm jumping from, this is a pretty big jump, 72 up to 81. Then I'm going to start stressing myself out again and upping the volume, upping the training stress, and starting to build through the next block. So week over week, we're looking for typically a maximum of around, I'd say 3 to 5 increase in chronic training loads. So 67 up to 70, that was only a 3 jump. And then 70 to 74, that's not too bad, up 4. Comes down a little bit. I do expect when I finish this week, I'm already over training stress a little bit. This might be a little bit higher, and this is a huge jump. So I may even look back at this and go, maybe I do want to dial some of this back. So when I talk about science and art, again, there's always going to be some degree of subjectivity in here. Training stress doesn't work really well for swimming, primarily because you don't work your watches very well. And it's not easy to capture the data. So actually, let me look at my run for a second. Training stress can be calculated a number of different ways depending on the data that you're collecting. So I'll start, actually, no, I will go back. I'm going to start with swimming. Most of my planned training stresses are actually just estimates. And again, based on that idea that if you swam as hard as you could for an hour, your training stress score would be 100. If you're doing more continuous swimming or open water swimming, the GPS watch isn't too bad. So basically what you would do is set your training zones of swimming, which is, again, typically based on your steady state swim pace, and then you can figure out whether you're going faster or slower than that, and that would give you a pretty accurate score. Once you start doing intervals in the pool, it gets a little bit more difficult. Every time you stop on the wall, if you're not being consistent and lapping your watch out, it usually adds meters to it, which would make your duration or your distance longer. A lot of watches will only capture the duration that you're actually swimming, which kind of messes up your duration metric. And then, you can calculate swim training stress by heart rate if you are capturing heart rate. Typically, again, it's going to be the optical sensor on the watch if you're wearing a watch while you're swimming, and that can be a little off as well. There are big limitations in heart rate as well, which I'll talk about when I get into the cycling side of things. But and then there are swimmers that, like myself sometimes, that just don't want to swim with a watch. And a lot of, if you're a swimmer, that's probably you. Triathletes, I know you love your watches. And then if that's the case, you pretty much just need to come in here when you complete a workout and just do a manual entry. And that's where, again, it's a little more subjective. So this workout here, I can't do it, enter anything in the completed field at the moment just because it hasn't happened yet. It's too far in the future. But if I just completed this swim, I would enter 1 hour. If I swam for an hour, if that was correct. The training stress, I'd just drop in as 30. This is an easier one. And that's really all I need. So the two main metrics that we're looking to capture are duration and training stress. I'll do a quick little tangent because you probably noticed all the little colors. All the colors are purely based on duration. if that's the way you have it set up or configured, and that's how I have it set up. You can configure it to training stress, so it'll turn different colors whether or how close you were in hitting the training stress, which to be honest is probably a little bit better, but I've just gotten used to looking at duration, and training stress score is always there anyway, so I can check it out. So if I was a little farther off on this one, like this run, I don't know, I only ran for 50 minutes. My compliance score is going to go down to yellow. If I was a little closer, like around an hour, that should, whoops, probably put in 60 minutes. No, I'm going to have to go a little less, 55. Oh no, sorry, yellow is close. Orange is a little farther away, so say I only did a 45-minute run. Still yellow. You're going to make me work, aren't you? 40, 30, there we go, orange. And then if I don't do anything and miss it, actually I already have scores in there, it would go red. So I'm going to pretend I was perfect because I can't remember what I had set it at. It won't matter anyway. And there you go. So that would be the colors. Again, you do have some of the summary data in terms of duration of your weekly score as well. And week over week, we're looking for a build. So thinking or moving on to cycling, and I'm going to move into or find a, well, this is, I wouldn't say this was a structured workout, but this was an Alpe du Zwift climb, so indoors. Cycling, I will say the gold standard is power. I would say it is power. Swimming is pace. Swimming, there's no elevation. Heart rate's not very good. So swimming is basically based on pace. If you're not using pace, I would say the best way to actually execute a workout would be rate of perceived exertion. And I would say that holds true for all workout types as the second best. So flipping back to cycling, you can calculate training stress by power. If it says TSS, that means it is calculating it by power. You can also calculate training stress by heart rate. So I can flip it here to heart rate, and you can see it's a little bit lower. And that's probably just a reason, or the reason that's the case is probably my heart rate training zones were just set a little bit lower than they should be, or higher than they should be, sorry. Higher? Yeah, higher. So I was working, my heart rate was lower than, the effort that it looked like to put out. So ideally these are pretty close. I'd say heart rate is a better correlator metric across the board. So it's not very good to prescribe or execute a workout with, just because there's so many variables that impact your heart rate. So that could be fatigue, it could be hydration, it could be, caffeine, temperature, etc. It also lags. So if you're doing intervals, heart rate's terrible. Especially if you're doing intervals that are 30 seconds to a minute, these short, higher intensity ones, because by the time your heart rate will get up to the effort that you're putting in, your interval's already done, and you probably haven't even reached that peak yet. That's why power is the gold standard. Power is power. So if you're pedaling around, at a specific wattage, and then you decide to increase it by, say 100 watts, it's instantaneous. It's reading it real time. And you can see that very simply let me find a more structured workout. This one here. Any of these workouts, you can click on the Analyze button, and it will bring you into an expanded view that you can see more data. And I did this workout on erg mode, meaning my smart trainer just changed the tension for me. And as you can see, it is perfect. So anytime the power increased from down here, which was recovery at 144 watts, 45 watts, and then, I hit an interval up to 290, it's instantaneous and it responds immediately. If I overlay heart rate, you can see it lags, and it lags terribly. So power went up here, but I don't actually hit my, I'm not even gonna say peak heart rate, because it probably, you know, if I was riding at this wattage for a longer period of time, technically my heart rate should be around 155, and I only peak out at 131 due to the duration, or the short duration. You can see this effort here, I get up to 136 just because I have a little more duration for the heart rate to respond. But that's a really good visual of why heart rate is not the best to one program, because you know, if I was to program this by heart rate, I'd say, okay, well, you got to, you know, do this interval at 155 beats, and there's no way. It's not going to happen. So if you have a power meter, that is going to be your best tool for measuring performance on the bike. And I will say also, it will be your best tool to measure performance on the run. A lot of companies now are putting power into their watches, heart rate monitors. If you have the investment ability, a Stride foot pod is the gold standard. However, they're the only power foot pod to my knowledge at the moment, at least making of this video, because they own all the patents and they are keeping it. So, heart rate, if you're running steady and just doing a long endurance run that doesn't have any variability, it can be a little bit more useful. But again, much better to use it as a correlator metric where you're checking out your power, and then you can see, you know, over time where your heart rate kind of is, and that can inform, you know, again, whether you are, you know, fatigued and need some rest, whether you're feeling good, whether it's getting super hot and you're getting dehydrated because the heart rate's continually going up. So it is an important piece of data that can give you a lot of good information used the right way. Again, going back to actually prescribing work, if you do, a lot of people have power on their indoor trainers because their smart trainer has a power meter, but then they don't have a power meter on their bike outside. And I would say, in terms of a training aspect and in using, you know, these types of tools, that would be your best investment by far for training. So if you can pick up a, you know, a crank power meter for $300-400, maybe used. You don't need to buy the $2,000 power pedals, but that would go a long way in terms of being able to do a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about. If not, then perceived exertion, just how hard you feel you're working, would be the next best. So if, for example, you were going outside and riding some hill repeats, and you know, it was programmed that you were to ride at threshold, hopefully you've done enough indoor riding, you kind of know what that feels like, you know what the breathing is like, you know what the pain feels like, and then you just replicate it based on feel. And you could go back and qualify that with looking at heart rate and where it kind of landed. But if you were executing the workout, again, you'd be better off to execute it based on rate of perceived exertion than you would heart rate. The other metrics in here are, we have, actually this is RPE, no, RPM, sorry, cadence, show all. You can click on these little boxes here and see more data. So you can see the terrain. Again, this was, yeah, it wouldn't have mattered because I was on erg mode. You can see the cadence that you're riding at, and you can see speed. Again, for cycling, unlike swimming, where speed would be your best metric, cycling speed would be pretty much your worst metric. Again, just because of the variables that impact speed, and particularly terrain being one of them. I remember when I lived in a place where it was pretty much all flat, my average ride paces would be anywhere between 36 to 40k an hour. When I came to the mountains, my average ride pace is probably 28 to 30 kilometers an hour. So big difference just based on terrain. You get a windy day. So again, speed is pretty much garbage. So I do have a lot of cyclists saying, oh, I want to do this ride and I want to hold this average speed of this. Well, what if it's windy? Or it's, you know, you're now doing this ride that is going through the mountains. So speed's bad. Group rides that are set up by speed are dumb. Actually, I shouldn't say that, because you usually do the same loop all the time, so you can get a little bit more specific in speed. But if you're doing different rides all the time, yeah, speed's not that great. Last one would be running, and let's look at. I'll look at some of these. I'll look at this interval run here. So again, as mentioned, power is going to be the gold standard. I didn't do power on this one. Where am I? March. I've been trying to use power as much as I can, but sometimes my pod... Yeah, I do have power on this one. So I'm going to show all. So again, power, gold standard. Again, it's instantaneous. You can see on these intervals, heart rate lags. A little bit better though. So, you know, the correlation for a little longer intervals, at least for me running, tends to be a little more responsive. But again, not as good as power. Pace is, I would say, second to power for running. If you're running flat. So I tend to do a lot of our test sets on either flat roads. If you can get on the track, that controls for a lot of variables, minus any super windy days if you're really exposed, or temperature fluctuations, that can have a little bit of an impact. As soon as you start running hills though, yeah, speed, just like cycling, kind of goes out the window. And then if you have power, great. If not, you can kind of almost defer back to heart rate and keep an eye on that. So if you're, you know, a trail runner and you're running up a mountain for the half hour, keep an eye on that heart rate, making sure it doesn't go too high. Might be your best gauge for intensity on an effort like that. So this is where all those different pieces can, you know, be useful in different scenarios. So in terms of exercise execution or prescription, again, power, I would say, is number one. Pace would be number two. If you're riding hill or running hills, again, I would stay with rate of perceived exertion, how hard it feels running those hills, and then keep an eye on the heart rate as a way to qualify your perceived exertion. So that would be my spiel on all the data collection methods for swim, bike, and run. Now, strength also has training stress in there. Training stress is calculated through metabolic output though. So unfortunately, the training stress when you're doing strength training doesn't really show up in training peaks, because typically you're going to be using heart rate to calculate that. And as you know, doing strength training, you can crush yourself in the gym with a really low heart rate. So typically this one would be a subjective one where I've made an estimation of probably is going to hurt you like this much in relation to, say, running or cycling. And you can just go in and do a manual entry to say, yeah, I did strength. I did pretty much what you asked me. Training stress is probably going to be something similar. And that kind of goes with cross-training activities as well. I do have some athletes that are skiers or cross-country skiers, or I don't know, they go for a hike or things like that. And sometimes you need to be a little subjective on the scores that you give yourself for that as well. Okay, so the next big question should be, well, how do I know what my intensity levels are? So every single workout, and actually let me open it up a little bit differently. Every single one of these workouts is built based on a percentage of your threshold. Now, and typically functional threshold. There are ways that we can, and let me even digress even farther. There's lots of definitions for threshold. I'm going to use a very basic one, which is what is the intensity you could hold or do for anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. That tends to be the range. And we typically do some field tests because we're not in the labs. We're not doing VO2 max tests with the gas analyzation, blood lactate, unless you have that. So we can basically get it pretty close by just sending you out and having you ride for a prolonged period of time, or run or swim. Or there have been different tests that have been developed over time based on research, which when I get into the setting of training zones, you're going to see a slew of them. They all pretty or much mean the same thing. They're pretty darn close. And again, they're based on this idea of sustainably hard effort as the baseline. And, you know, there's a kind of a tipping point that happens at that threshold. I don't want to get into too much of the physiology. I think I'll save that one for another talk. But we're looking to find that tipping point, and then we can set training zones below and above that, again, based on whatever your result is. And I'm going to take you through the swim, bike, and run tests and why we do them, and give you a couple different options and, you know, some of the benefits and limitations of these tests that we do. But again, I'll leave some of the physiology to another day. Just know that you can program based on, again, what you have. So most of what I do is programmed based on functional threshold power. I should say for running, it's programmed on pace, assuming you're going to run flat. Cycling, pretty much always power, but you can do it based on maximum heart rate. I don't do that. I'd say that's one of the least accurate ones, and finding your max heart rate's incredibly painful, basically doing short intervals, like a minute long, as hard as you can for as long as you can push your heart rate up for. So high risk of injury, higher risk of death. So don't do much on the max heart rate. Threshold heart rate is something we can find when we're doing some of these longer sustained efforts, like a 20-minute FTP test, a 5K run test. Pace, kind of similar. We can figure out, you know, where your pace kind of settles in, and I'll actually show you some of the testing that I've done just so you can break it down. And then we could program it based on rate of perceived exertion as well. So all these bars here, you know, run this bar at a 5 out of 10, and then a 6 out of 10, and then a 7 out of 10. Not as accurate, and doesn't give you as much flexibility in terms of building intensities, but you know, it can be used. So setting those, let's start with the test. Yeah, we'll start with the test set. So I will say one of the most common test sets is in swimming anyway, and I'll start with swimming and then I'll go to cycling and then running, is the CTS or the CSS. You'll probably see both. Basically, you do a 400 meter for time and a 200 meter for time, and this is almost equivalent to doing like a 5-minute test on the bike, where you're working at VO2 max. This would be an intensity just higher than threshold. So basically, you're trying to find the limit where you're going to be utilizing as much oxygen as possible. So it really kind of has a ceiling. One of the difficulties is pacing all these out, and I will say that any test set takes practice. So you may not get it right the first time. Unfortunately, if you don't, you gotta do it again. But over time, you'll get better and better, and as you know your zones and train at them and push yourself at these levels, you'll get more attuned to what paces you can hold or powers you can hold for any duration, and it gets better, don't worry. So essentially for this test, and I do like this one because you can do something like a timed 1500, and I do that with my athletes a lot, more for mental resiliency, race preparation, getting up and going hard for that long, but it is a mentally taxing test, and I'll say physically taxing as well. So you could just do a prolonged swim and figure out kind of where that time settles in at, And depending on how quick the athlete is, you may want to adjust a few seconds up and down, because again, we're trying to find steady state swim pace, which, for example, if you're a pretty accomplished swimmer, and let's say for argument's sake, you just held 130s and you did 22 and change across the 1500, not quite a half hour to an hour. So, you probably are going to add 2 to 3 seconds per 100, and that would bring you into that kind of steady state. Doing this test, there are calculators that I'm going to show you. I have one on our website as well that you can use. But one of the neat things about this test is it will actually take in consideration the difference of average pace between the 400 and the 200, and then almost determine how much energy contribution is provided by your aerobic system and your anaerobic system. And again, we're not going to get into the physiology of it, but obviously the anaerobic system, that's a short, explosive, you get that energy really quickly. Some people are more on that side of the spectrum. And then you have the aerobic system, that is the long, sustained efforts. And some people are on that end of the spectrum. Depending on what you're training for, you may want to train one more than the other. So this also gives you a good indication of, if you're a highly anaerobic driven athlete, and again, I have a lot of endurance athletes that are coming from sports like hockey and football and soccer that have these really fast, hard, explosive efforts that are short. They tend to be more that anaerobically driven, and they tend to die in the longer distances. And then vice versa, I have athletes that only go long and slow, maybe don't have a sporting background, and they have no speed change, and we may want to develop that side of things as well. So you can make that determination for yourself. But basically, you can swim any warm-up you like. I have my structure of warm-up that I like to do. And then, you swim a 400 meters, try to fully recover. So kind of 8 to 10 minutes of just easy swimming, flushing it out. And then you do a 200 meter. And that tends to be more of that anaerobic side of things. And then all you need to do is take those times. So I actually did this the other day. What did I swim? It's coming. 5:27 and 2:36. So 5:27 on the 4, 2:36 on the 200. So in your settings, and you'll have your name up in the top right-hand corner, clicking on settings. You can either scroll down or just click on zones, and you're going to see all the different types of zones. So we have heart rate zones, and you can segregate them or create different zones for different activities. Typically, you are going to have different threshold heart rates for swimming, biking, and running. Swimming is going to be the lowest. Biking depends on your background. If you're come from a running background, you might be more efficient running than you are cycling. Typically, with muscle activation, you're going to have a little higher heart rate running than cycling for most people. But again, not always the case. So we got heart rate zones. We have power zones. And again, I do run with power, so I do have power zone, which I need to actually set today as well. And then we have speed pace zones. And this is where you're going to find the swim one. If you ever need to add an activity, when you scroll down at the bottom of each one, you can click add and then what type of sport you want to add. So right now, I am set at a 130 per 100 meter kind of steady state pace. If I go to, I did a CTS field test. And again, you can see you're going to have a whole bunch of options. Wait till you see the bike one. There's going to be a lot of research done in cycling. Pretty much training zones were developed in the sport of cycling. So I did the CTS. You can do, if you did say a distance for time, you could put that in and it will calculate out for you. If you just know your threshold, yeah, I wouldn't use that one. Anyway, so I can enter my result, which unfortunately I don't know at the moment. But again, I have built it in our website. If you're not a KTC member, you can go online and just search CSS or CTS calculator, and there's a few out there that you can find. But if you go to testing in the members area, you can scroll down through all our results, and then basically you're entering your 400 meter time. So just the minutes, and then I did it. I think it was 27, and then minutes and seconds and 85.5 seconds. So I just need to take that 85.5, put it into here, calculate. Sorry, choose method. There we go. Calculate. And now I have my swim training zone. So it says my threshold's at 126. So I should be able, and again, this is in a short course pool, 25 meter pool. I should be able to hold 126s for a half hour to an hour. Put me in a long course pool, that probably jumps up for about 130, maybe 131. Put me in the open water, maybe with a wetsuit, that could be equivalent. So again, it really depends on how you test. So you do need to put context or know the context towards your testing and what it's actually telling you, because you change a couple of those variables, it can throw everything off. So my base interval, pace swim, so this would be, nice and easy, cruisy. This would be, uncomfortably hard, really fast, all out, 9 seconds for 100 meters. That's not gonna happen. Maybe 104 on a good day from a dive. So I do want to set that if I am using my watch correctly, and I am capturing how quickly I'm doing particular interval distances, then it will generate a pretty accurate training stress score for me when I'm swimming. The kicker is if you are using fins and paddles or kickboards, that's going to throw a whole bunch of variables into the mix, and that's where I say swimming doesn't work that good unless you are literally swimming the way you tested, freestyle, in the pool, in the distance that you were testing in, and working your watch perfectly. So that's where swimming, yeah. So moving on to cycling. Cycling, you have a couple different options, and actually, do I have, so again, cycling, you can do a half hour to an hour as hard as you can. This is one of the reasons we did some of these Alp to Zwift climbs, is because it took a good duration of time, I think, from the start to finish. And you can highlight these and then get the summary data on the other side here. That was a 45-minute effort. I was able to hold just under 300 watts, 298 watts. So I'd be pretty confident that my threshold is going to be around 300. So you can do that if you're up for the pain. If you're not up for the pain, typically a 20-minute FTP test can be used. So do the whole warm-up thing. Go as hard as you can for 20 minutes, and then you're going to multiply that by 0.95. So basically, you're going to knock off 5% because you're trying to extrapolate it out from 20 minutes to 30 to 60 minutes. So that one tends to be fairly accurate. One of the good things about the longer tests is that you can actually then start seeing heart rate where it should settle in at a particular point. So, there is going to be drift all the way up. You may stabilize. I don't know if this was 100% effort or the heart rate was just a little bit lower that night. Usually I'm sitting more, up here at the 155 range. And again, that's just based on my knowledge of me and my training history. So now I can, get power data, but I can also, set my heart rate threshold as well. So heart rate in terms of determining that tends to be a little bit more subjective, especially in, it can be used in the run as well. And really when we're looking at setting heart rate thresholds, we're looking at kind of where it stabilizes off. So the back half, typically, if you're doing a 20-minute test, look at your last 10 minutes and you can kind of see where it's, settled in at. Again, you need to consider a lot of the variables like heat and primarily heat and hydration in terms of that impact on heart rate. So if you're doing a 20-minute test indoors with no fan, you're probably gonna have a little higher heart rate than if you were in cooler environment. And yeah. So the other option for power zones on the bike, if you're doing indoors, is going to be a ramp test. Most of the softwares, if you're riding indoors, like on Zwift or things like that, they have built-in ramp tests where it just increases the wattage by a particular amount until you go to failure. And then it'll spit out kind of your, I shouldn't say kind of, your estimated FTP at the end of that. And essentially what it does, it takes your last minute of power, divides it by 0.75, just the way, again, the research was done. And that gives you a estimation as well. The nice thing about the ramp test is it is the least painful. One of the limitations is you're not going to get heart rate zones from that as well. So you're purely going to get your power data. So the last thing, or the last zone setting, would be running. And again, one of the best ways would be to do a sustained run. If you have a 10K race, that is perfect. If you're a little slower, 5K works. 5K is kind of, similar to that 20-minute test. I did a 5K today. Again, I recommend controlling for as many variables as possible, the main one being terrain. So we actually had to wait around for, 20 minutes here. We waited for the track to freeze, or unfreeze, sorry. And it was still a little frozen, which may have, not made for the best test, but if you can get on a track, awesome. Flat road would be really good. Treadmill works really well. Again, control for the heat and in hydration. If you're running indoors, get a fan on you. And again, you can kind of see where the pace is. This is based on lots of experience. So a lot of people I will see start really slow and build through it. And some people will start really fast and just die a miserable death. Either one is bad. So you want it as consistently paced as possible. And as you can see, I can overlay heart rate on there, and it just drifts and drifts and drifts. I would say I kind of hit, threshold. I'd be confident kind of in here, and then I tried to push the last little bit, which might have peaked me up a little bit more. So my average heart rate, 159, that's kind of checks out to where I've been at threshold. So I'd be pretty confident heart rate threshold I could probably set at 159 if I was to use any of those metrics, like running uphill. And then I can look at my pace across the entire run, which pace, where is it? Down here, 3:30. Now, I don't think I could hold that for much longer. I would probably, I'm going to put my threshold pace at about 335. Between 335 and 340, I would say would be a good range. So it's not perfect, but it gives you a good indicator. And I will say on any given day, your threshold will probably vary 5%. Just as an estimate. Whether you show up fatigued, dehydrated, etc., you're going to perform better on some days than others. So again, if you get it pretty close, the data that you're going to be capturing that I started at with those big pictures will still be pretty darn good. So when I look at run heart rate, it's 163. I'm going to bring that down to 159. Again, there are lots of ways that you can do it. So lactic threshold, max heart rate, you can do max heart rate, max and resting heart rate, and lactic threshold and max heart rate. So again, I'm just taking the lactic threshold. Lots of, again, options in terms of who's done what research and what, how many zones you want to go from. Some have 7, some have 5, some have 10. typically I do a lot of Joe Friel stuff, being one of the first training books I ever read. Joe Friel's Triathlon Training Bible. And then I'm going to take his running training zones, calculate it, apply it, and here are my new zones. I didn't really talk about the zones per se. Again, typically they're very similar, even though they may be named different things, as you know, if you do kind of play around in here and check different ones out. But essentially we have a recovery zone, zone 1, zone 2, which would be that low aerobic, zone 3 tempo, which would be the upper aerobic. Threshold can be broken into a couple different ones. So sub-threshold, just below threshold, and then super threshold, which would be just above threshold. And Joe Friel's done that because there's nothing really happening at threshold. That's just threshold. So you can either work just a little below and work a little more duration, or work a little above and try to push it up a little bit. Then we have anaerobic or aerobic capacity, or sometimes termed as VO2 max. I use that term quite a bit. And then anaerobic capacity, which is, again, just as it sounds, as hard as you can go for a short duration. So it just gives you kind of where heart rates would fall into, and it would do the same for power, for pace. As you'll see for run power, and actually we'll do pace because I can't remember what my power was. So at the moment I had it set at 340, just because it'll make me feel good. I'm going to drop it 5 seconds. Again, I'm going to choose my threshold speed. I'm going to actually use... no, stay on Joe Friel stuff. Yeah. And now I have training zones. So again, recovery, it doesn't actually title in this one, but tempo, threshold, or yeah, sub-threshold, threshold, VO2 max, anaerobic capacity. Save and close that one. And when, as you see that little dialog box, that'll actually apply all those new thresholds to all the future workouts. So now I have to run faster. That's the problem with testing. And the last thing I could look at there was my power, which again would be the gold standard. I made sure that I did wear my power pod today. Looks like it corrupts out here. That's what happened. I lost that at the end. My music cut out, and I was like, oh, I wonder what happened. And I think I lost everything. So average of 354 watts. Again, I was pretty consistent. So, you know, I can probably multiply that by 0.95. Very similar to the methodology for cycling, which is 354 times 0.95, 336. Probably didn't need to go through all of this, but if it was helpful at all, at least bringing context, sometimes I don't know what you don't know. So power, and I want run power. Obviously run power is typically quite a bit higher than cycling power. I'm going to use, I think I'm using Gym Advanced Running. Yeah, that'll work. Okay. And now I am confident that my training zones are set, so that when I am capturing the data from however I'm capturing it based on all the variables that I went through, which maybe I'll have to rewatch back, then I should have some accurate training stress scores in which I then can determine how much I can plan to stress myself out, evaluate how well I executed, how I stressed myself out, and then how well I'm actually resting, which again is when I am getting better and faster. This data is also really useful when you're doing racing in terms of looking at, you know, what are the duration of the events, and, you know, what paces should I be able to hold. So I'll leave that one for another talk as well. But once you get all this dialed in, I can pretty much be very specific in terms of what I can hold for, say, in a triathlon. if I'm doing a sprint, I can do this pace for, whatever the duration of the swim is. If 700-meter swim, I can dial that in pretty close, probably within a second or two. The bike, I know exactly the wattage that I should be able to hold for, say, 20K or 40K, depending on, again, the distance of the race. Geez, even up to Ironman. And then same with the run. If the run is 5K, 10K, 42K, I know what my body can do for those durations, and that's exactly what I can expect on race day. Maybe a little better, a little less, but I would say pretty darn close, probably within 5%. I can estimate my finish times based on the data that I collect and how well I know what I can do. Obviously, in the sport of triathlon, across all three, it does come down, but if I'm just going out for a 10K run, I can tell you right now that I'm probably going to be able to do a 3:35 minute per K. Even this morning, I kind of knew I was going to be right in and around that 3:30 based on some of these 1 kilometer repeats that I had done in weeks prior. So other than that, the next thing that we'll need to talk about is keeping your data nice and clean and some of the maintenance behind it. But hopefully that gives you a really good foundation of how you can use Training Peaks, collecting data from different devices, and again, whether it be watches, computers, just going in there and objectively putting what you think the training stress was. Duration should be pretty simple if you have any type of watch. And that will, again, set the foundation for all your future training. So until next time, we'll talk to you soon.